morning, everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome David Smith, also known as SirLoyalHeart, who is a fabulous historical reenactor of the young Henry VIII. And we're going to be talking about how he brings this character to life and how he has managed to bring this new sort of nuance to Henry VIII. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm so excited to be able to talk about your performance because I remember we met a year ago for a mutual friend's book launch as Henry VIII, and I remember being so starstruck by you and by your performance. It was such an amazing thing, and it's not something you see every day. So it was quite interesting to be able to see how you brought him to life.
Thank you. I mean, they're very kind words, and I can't believe the book launch that we met at was a year ago. I mean, how time flies.
I know, it's quite incredible, isn't it? I think before we go into you talking about your incredible performance as Henry VIII and your career as a historical reenactor, I was wondering if you could give us some sort of insight into where your love and passion for history first started and what was it about Henry VIII that so appealed to you?
My love for history started when I was a child, longer than I can remember, but specifically the Tudors. It was when I was in year three. So, for anyone listening to this in the States or in different countries, year three, you in school, you would be about ages 7 and 8. And I remember my aunt taking me to the Tower of London and they had reenactors there. And I vividly remember a lady talking about her execution. And my guess now is probably Anne Boleyn talking about her execution and what Henry VIII did to her. And I also remember watching David Starkey's documentary, The Six Wives of the Henry VIII. And I was just starstruck about this king who wasn't supposed to be king, and then he becomes king and he marries 6 times, he kills 2 of his wives, and he wants a son. And I was just gripped. Elizabeth I was another historical figure from the Tudors that I was absolutely gripped on, and they were really the main two when I was in school. And ever since then, I've just fixated my attention on the Tudors. And then there'll be brief periods where we'll deviate away from the Tudors and look at a different historical period. It generally tends to be the Egyptians because they're another fascinating civilization and another fascinating period of history. But yeah, Henry VIII is just, well, there's no words to describe him in terms of a historical figure. Everybody knows who he is. He's that famous, or infamous, if you want to say infamous, because of his his want for a son and what he did to obtain that.
And I agree with you that he is so fascinating because if you think about it, if his older brother had died, we wouldn't have the history that we have, and we wouldn't have so much fascination into the Tudors because Arthur probably wouldn't have been as, dare I say, tumultuous as Henry VIII.
Possibly not, no. I mean, 1501, he marries Catherine of Aragon, and they obviously move to Ludlow Castle, her and Arthur. And Arthur falls sick and he dies in 1502. And he had a different upbringing to Henry VIII. He was brought up with obviously Henry VII and Henry VII's court. He had his tutors, and his tutors preparing Arthur to become king, where Henry VIII doesn't get that. What Henry VIII gets, he gets a warm, loving childhood. He grows up at Eltham Palace with his mother and his sisters. So at this point, I believe Margaret and possibly Elizabeth, obviously when Mary is born as well, she would grow up at Eltham with them as well. But even though Henry VIII had this loving childhood, his father didn't give him much attention, which is natural for a second-born son of a king. Though he does get attention from his father in the titles that Henry VII bestows onto Henry VIII. For example, Constable of the Cinque Ports at Dover, Duke of York, he's made a Knight of the Order of Bath, and these are all before he's 5 years old. So Henry VIII is being shown off to the public, especially when he's created Duke of York. But that is a very clever thing that Henry VII does on his part, because he's stating that there's only one Duke of York, and it's not Richard, Duke of York, who is in the Tower with his brother Edward V. It's my son, Henry, Duke of York. So he's, stamping out that claim of Richard, Duke of York, or Edward V still being alive, with the pretenders and whatnot. But Henry VIII's childhood is also shrouded by death. So he loses his sister Elizabeth. He'll eventually lose his brother Arthur and his brother Edmund. He'll lose his mother, and he will also lose a very good close friend of his that he makes in 1506, which is Philip, Duke of Burgundy, who is the husband of Joanna of Castile. So I think you have to take everything into consideration with Henry VIII's upbringing and how that shapes him to become king.
It's quite fascinating as well as the fact that he's the second son and Arthur is the first. And yet, despite his, tragic life, he dies very young. He dies as a teenager. He doesn't even get to become king. It's his younger brother that becomes so. There's not a lot of mention of Arthur other than the fact that he dies young. There's nothing seen in books, there's nothing seen in television, and anything to do with Henry VIII. It's just a brief mention that his brother dies young. And we have quite a lot of portrayals of Henry himself. I mean, we've seen countless movies, countless productions, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, Jude Law, Damian Lewis, all bringing different versions of this character to life. And there's always some sort of criticism with these portrayals, whether he acts like Henry, looks like Henry. Whilst you yourself, you look a lot like Henry. You can see in the portraits how much similar you are. Is that what brought you to decide you want to bring Henry VIII to life?
I completely agree that Arthur's not really mentioned or seen or heard about in history at all, or portrayed in history. I know that there is a book about Arthur. I can't remember the fella's name. He does the social media Royal History Geeks. I'm pretty sure it's him. He wrote a book on Arthur, and apparently it's quite a good read. But yeah, there's been countless portrayals of Henry VIII. Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, Jude Law, Damian Lewis. But they're all great. But the best one is Keith Michelle. He has my heart when it comes to Henry VIII, actors or portrayals in TV, because he is fantastic. Jude Law came very, very close, but the rest of them don't have a patch on Keith Michelle. So I've always loved Henry VIII. I've been obsessed with him since I was about 8 years old. And I've always liked acting. When I was in school, I would help out in the history department, putting on little performances for people that were coming in to see the history department. So history and acting kind of went hand in hand with each other. So I saw this costume for sale, a Henry VIII costume, and I liked the look of it. I thought, well, to be fair with you, this is actually not too bad of a costume. My understanding of Tudor clothing at that point wasn't great, and the accuracy of outfits wasn't great. But I bought the outfit anyway, and I posted it on Facebook, and everybody told me how similar I look to Henry VIII, that I just look like a young Henry, or you are young Henry. They're not telling me I look like him. They're saying you are young Henry. And a particular woman comments on this. And little did I know that she is the maker and owner of Tudor Dreams Historical Costumia. And I messaged her page not knowing that she commented on my post, asking her how much an outfit would cost if she was to make me one. And she got in touch with me and she said, this is how much an outfit will cost. And I've got a group that you might be interested in, and they're looking for a young Henry. They're looking for a young Henry, and you think I'd be suitable for the role? And she said yes. And my first thing that I said was, I'm not Henry's height. Will that be okay? Because I'm not 6'2". I'm a bit smaller than that. But that was the first thing, because the first thing that popped into my head, well, I'm not going to be accurate enough because I'm not as tall as Henry. I'm just a little bit smaller. And she said, no, you'll be fine. You look like Henry. And I just remember jumping around the garden, because that was just like a dream come true for me. Someone that is so passionate about Henry VIII. Now I'm actually going to be able to represent him through dressing up as him and acting as him. And I remember it was on the 21st of June. 2021. I went to Penshurst Place. They lent me an outfit and I reenacted as Henry for the first time there. And when I look back on the photos, one, you can see how young my face is, and my face is morphed more into Henry VIII now than it did back then. So I cringe at the photos now. But I just remember feeling like embodying Henry VIII and, having that commanding presence about the people that I was reenacting with, and plus the members of the public. It was a very surreal experience. And now it's almost second nature. Like, Henry has become a massive part of my identity. Everybody that knows me for Henry VIII.
And especially when I met you at our friend, it's Clemmy Bennett. Our viewers might know her as the author of The Apple on the Tree, fantastic book. If you'd seen David at this event, it was like everybody in the room went quiet when you walked in, and everyone was just like, wow. Like, because you truly did look like Henry VIII, down to like the tiniest detail. And it was quite astonishing. And then you started speaking. It was like, wow, we've gone back in time to the Tudors, which I'm thanking God that you do the young Henry, because if you'd done the older Henry, I think I'd be quite scared of you.
Yeah, I remember walking into the room where we was doing the book launch at the bookshop, and I remember Clemmy being there and yourself being there, and obviously Nathan Amin. Obviously Owen Emerson was there as well, and I remember you all standing there looking at me, and I started speaking. Yeah, I mean, you weren't scared of me. That's good, but I have had people scared of me before. I did an event last September at Hever Castle, a banquet event, and I was really in character for that event. So it was like an immersive first-hand experience to dine with Henry VIII, and it was a great experience. And the waiting staff came in and they served the fella who was portraying Thomas Boleyn before me. I went to town on this poor waiter. I didn't shout at him, but I used my language, tone of voice, and all of that sort of stuff, and chastised this waiter, and his face went as white as a ghost. I thought the waiting staff were generally intimidated. So I have intimidated people before as Henry VIII.
I just don't know how you don't get nervous at all, because I would be quite nervous to walk into a room and everybody look at me, because it's not only just the way you look, but it's also the way you sound as well, because we know that Henry says certain things through his letters and through documents, and you bring these to life. Is there any kind of research that you do before specific events? Like if you're going to say, if you like with Clemmy's book launch, do you practice anything that you might say in your head before you go? Is there any kind of behind the scenes info you can give us?
So when I'm prepping for an event, if it's for my own event, I generally set a year, and anything that I'll speak about will be relevant to that year. So, for example, when I do Grinthorpe Castle, sometimes I portray an older Henry. It's a more generic Henry. It's just Henry VIII rather than a young Henry or an old Henry. It's just Henry VIII because Grinthorpe Castle, I normally have Catherine Howard there because Henry and Catherine visited there in 1541, or I might set it earlier in the 1520s. Even though Henry didn't visit Grinthorpe, there's still connection to Henry VIII because he gifted Grinthorpe Castle to Catherine of Aragon's lady in waiting, Maria de Salinas. I think that was 1515, possibly. I might have got the date wrong. But I will do research if I need to, in terms of if there is a particular date that we're setting for an event. I will make sure that all of the information that I have is relevant to that year or before. So when I did Hever Castle in May, I set the year in 1533 because I knew coming up was the 1st of June, which was Anne Boleyn's coronation. So I was in a very jovial mood. And when I was doing the banquet at Hever in May, it was very much talking about the preparations for Anne's coronation and talking about the fact that she's obviously with child, and the astrologers, the astronomers, the physicians all said it's going to be a son. That's what we did at Hever. I like to quote Henry. So I do a lot of research on his letters. I do a lot of research on any speeches that he gave. So, for example, the last speech he gave to Parliament on Christmas Eve in 1544 or 45. No, 45, I think it was. 44. So I do have done research on that. I've just recently acquired a beautiful little gem, a 1668 copy of his book, Defense of the Seven Sacraments, or Asserto Septem Sacramentorum. So I will read that now and get an understanding of Henry as a theologian. So yeah, I will do research before I do an event.
And with these events, I know that you said that you do them in different time periods. Do you have different costumes for different parts of Henry's reign, or do you try to just get one that you think embodies him the best? Because I know that with the costume you wore for Clemmy's event, it was so beautiful, and then we were trying not to look down because, as Henry has in his portraits, the massive codpiece, which when you don't want to look because it seems rude, but it's like it's part of the costume. Like, how do you wear that and like not feel like a little bit oof, this bit too much?
I see it as clothing. So that's really all there is to wearing the costume is I don't see it as a costume. I see it as clothing, and if you see it as clothing, you get more in touch with the clothing. You come more to terms with the fact that some things can look a little bit obscene to the 21st century eye, but if you apply yourself to 16th century England or 16th century Europe, you're going to see a lot of codpieces, not just by the nobles, but by the lower class as well, because the codpiece was essentially, other than a symbolic phallic structure trying to emulate masculinity and virility, it acted as your flies. Like we have flies on jeans today, it would be tied up with two little points, and it basically gave you easy access to go to the toilet rather than having to take the entire thing off. So I own 4 outfits for Henry VIII, including 1 spare doublet. So I've got 5 doublets. I believe I've got 4 jerkins, 4 gowns, and 4 pairs of hose. So all my outfits can be dated to 1535 or before in terms of the portraits that I've taken them from. 2 of the outfits one comes from 1519, the other is 1520. So I've got a silver and gold doublet with a red overgown with gold trim. And that's a very, very rare portrait of Henry VIII. And I don't believe that a lot of people have seen it, but if they have, you'll recognise it. Henry's very young, he's bearded, he's got long hair, and the portrait dates to 1519. The second one is a more well-known portrait of Henry VIII, though not as well-known as the Holbein portrait of him. Dates in 1520. Henry's wearing a black doublet with gold slashing. He's got a fur gown on. Again, he's bearded. He holds a ring in his hand, and he's got long hair, again, cut in the French fashion. So that dates to 1520. So if I'm doing anything in the 1520s, they are generally the 2 outfits that I will wear. Then 1530s, so we're talking more Anne Boleyn's time now as Queen, or towards the beginning of Jane Seymour's tenure as Queen. I have 2 portraits that date to 1535. Well, the first is Jules von Cleve's portrait. I've recreated that. And depending on, or where you go to, will depend on what date you get for this portrait, but it dates between 1532 to 1535. And then the other, again, is a lesser known portrait of Henry VIII. It's quite an ugly portrait of Henry VIII, to be fair, but the outfit's nice. He has Almain sleeves. So if you don't know what Almain sleeves are, they are literally sleeves that have got like 2 bands, and then they got these panes. And basically what it does is it exposes the shift underneath, which is your shirt. So it looks like you've got nice puffing. And that dates to 1535. You can go and see that portrait at the National Portrait Gallery. Henry VIII has got long hair, he's got a feathered cap, and he has really, really, really deformed looking hands, really tiny looking hands. Yeah, all my outfits are inspired by portraits.
And it's a good thing that we have these portraits, and that the Tudors were almost obsessed with having portraits in a way, because it gives historical reenactors like yourself the opportunity to bring them to life. Because we've seen, I know you've shared pictures of, Cardinal Wolsey, you've shared pictures of yourself with, Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon. There's so many people who are able to bring these historical figures to life because of the portraits. If we didn't have them, I think we'd be struggling quite a lot. And I just wanted to know, I know that the historical reenactment community probably isn't that well known in terms of people knowing it's a thing, but what's been your response from joining the community? And I think the obvious question is, have you found all your 6 wives yet?
I have found 6 wives. I've worked with 6 wives quite a few times. I did an event in Ipswich a few years ago. I posted on my SirLoyalHeart page on Facebook, I need 6 wives, and I had many people message me. So if I needed 6 wives, I could get a lineup of 6 wives. There's not a job in the world where you'd ever say that, is there?
No, I think people would find that quite weird if you just said, I need 6 wives. I think without the Henry VIII to back you up, I think people think, okay.
It's funny, isn't it? The things you say in your job, in your daytime job. Mine is, I need 6 wives. Come on, I need to find 6 women to be my wife. So the reenactment community, well, now I'm very well established as Henry VIII. I think if you go to pretty much anyone that knows, well, within the reenactment community that know, or that does specifically Tudor reenactment, they will know who I am, whether they've met me or not, worked with me, or seen me act. They will definitely know who I am, which is nice to know, because I've spent so long trying to build up a reputation to be someone, a reenactor that is accurate, that takes pride in what they do because, I'm not an academic historian. I didn't go to university. All my research, all my study has been independently done by me. I've used the same sources that academics have used. I've used the National Archives. I own part of the collection of the State Calendar Papers of Henry VIII. So I own Hall's Chronicle. So everything that, to get contemporary sources, I own Henry VIII's letters, like his love letters, for example. All of these things I use to embody my portrayal of Henry VIII. And I'm very well versed in Henry VIII, and that's what I want, because I want to take the knowledge that I have on him and the understanding that I have on him and then bring that through my portrayal. So when I do portray him at an event, I'm believable. You can almost start to, second guess your reality and think, actually, if I was standing in 1522 and Henry VIII was stood in front of me, that is who I would imagine.
I just keep thinking back to the launch party because it's still so surreal, the fact that you were able to come, because everyone was talking and then there's just Henry VIII just standing in the room, and you almost forget for a second that you are an actor, because it literally did feel like the aura, the feel of the room changed. Have you ever gone to an event and the response that you've got from people is just so overwhelming that you think, this is why I became a historical reenactor?
Yes. One of the events that I absolutely love doing, and it was a dream come true for me, was Hampton Court Palace in June that's just gone. So on the 22nd of June, myself, a good friend of mine called Samantha, and another good friend of mine called George, we go to Hampton Court Palace as part of Historic Royal Palace's project called Henry VIII on Tour, which looks at the itinerary of Henry VIII's progresses, from the people that were involved to the progresses all the way down to the food and music. And we were asked to recreate a procession and meeting between Henry VIII and Charles V. And then we progressed from Clock Tower into the Chapel Royal, and they did a service in Latin. I think it was the Vespers, and something that doesn't really get done anymore at all today, especially in Latin. So it was a real surreal moment. And the people that were there were just, absolutely in awe as we just walked through Hampton Court Palace, and the people were lining up on the sides taking videos, and you can just see how mesmerized they are. But in that moment, you feel like the person that you're portraying, like you try to step back and try and think what they were thinking while this was happening. So that was a really good event. Italy, I've been to Italy as Henry VIII. Again, crowds lining up on the streets to see us, process down the streets. We're talking tens of thousands of people lining up on the streets for this particular procession over the statue that they have over there, which is linked to Ipswich. So there was a shrine in Ipswich that was destroyed in 1538. The statue of the Virgin Mary was then taken to Chelsea to be burned. It disappears for 12 years, and then in 1550 it lands in Italy. So each year from, I think, 2007, the Italians from the Tuno recreate that landing of the statue. But because it's connected to Ipswich, me and my good friend Phil, we went over there to represent Ipswich, him as Cardinal Wolsey, being born in Ipswich, and myself as Henry VIII, because Henry VIII made pilgrimage to the statue. So that was a very remarkable event. So there's so many events that I've done where I've got great response from the public. But what I love even most is taking Henry VIII into schools and teaching the kids Henry VIII and the Tudors, and especially busting common myths about him, because I think it's taught in schools that Henry VIII, they all automatically just think he was very fat all the time. He was very old all the time, that he was greedy, that he would, not eat with grace, decorum, or respect, which is, that's not true. We know that Henry VIII would have ate with manners and etiquette, but it all starts when they're in school. So we'll bust those myths. But seeing the children's eyes when you go in as Henry VIII, they believe that you're Henry.
I completely agree with you, because I remember when I'm in my 20s now, but I remember when I was in school, they used to say, oh, Henry VIII was this big, fat, and they, to not be quite rude, but they would sometimes say pig of a king, that he was obsessed with, having a son, which to a degree he was, and that he was horrible to all his wives, which isn't completely true, because he wasn't always horrible. So I would imagine that if I'd had someone like yourself come into my school when I was a child and, bring Henry to life, it would have made such a difference on the amount that we know, because there's so much about the Tudors, not only just Henry VIII, that is so misconstrued and is taught wrong, especially with Anne Boleyn. We see people still thinking that she had 6 fingers, which is not true at all.
Yeah, blame Nicholas Sanders for that. Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's there's still a lot of misconceptions about the Tudors, a lot of misconceptions about Henry VIII, and my aim, my goal as portraying young Henry is to show people that actually Henry VIII was young. Henry VIII was jovial. Henry VIII was not a big fat pig of a king, as you said, and that's reflective for majority of his reign. It's only the last 10 years do we see what I would say is a drastic change in Henry's persona, a drastic change in his weight, and a drastic change in his temperament. But for the most part, Henry VIII is not feared, he's respected and he's loved. David Starkey made a very good point about Henry, that Henry was a gentle husband, that Henry married for love, probably explains why the only political marriage between Henry and a wife was so disastrous, and that was Anna Cleves. That definitely contributed to the destruction of that marriage, plus the fact that she bruised his ego. But that was the only political marriage. But the rest of them, Henry VIII knew them. Henry VIII fell in love with them because they were there in person. And I mean, look at Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. I mean, they get married in 1509, and especially for the first 10 years of that marriage, it's such a loving marriage. I mean, they've had gold necklaces with love hearts with H and K, found from the ground, showing Henry VIII's initials with Catherine of Aragon. I mean, the fact that the pomegranate and the Tudor rose are morphed into one symbol, and then from the pomegranate side you see another Tudor rose emerge. I mean, that symbolism and that unity between two people is not seen with any of the other wives in such a large scale. Of course, you get Anne Boleyn's emblem in Hampton Court and whatnot, but you don't get it merged to Henry's own emblem. I mean, Henry VIII worshipped Catherine of Aragon. He worshipped Anne Boleyn. I can't say this. He worshipped Catherine Howard for definite. I mean, he started losing weight when he was with Catherine Howard. He felt young again. But David Starkey mentions that he's a gentle husband, and the only time that Henry VIII becomes a bad husband when he no longer considers himself married to you.
And speaking of the wives, because we can't obviously have Henry VIII without having his 6 wives. I mean, they practically made him famous besides his, tyrannical ways at the end of his reign. Is there a wife that you perhaps not favor, but perhaps like doing events with more because you can, and bring out what you want to bring out in Henry, would be it Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, or even Catherine Parr, who is still considered today one of the least important wives he ever had, even though she was probably just as important as the other 5.
And when it comes to importance of wives, I'd say they're all important in their own right. I would say not one wife has more significance than the other, because they all do different things at different times. I mean, 37 years in 16th century England, that's a long time, and that has a lot of change. But in terms of an event, I mean, Catherine of Aragon is the wife that I prefer to do events with, because that's when, I mean, my age and how I portray Henry, he was married to Catherine of Aragon. And I think it's actually quite nice to show Catherine of Aragon and Henry in a very different light compared to what we often get, which is Henry VIII is married to this Spanish woman. He loves her for a little bit, and now he wants to get divorced, and the whole thing's set on divorce until he gets to Anne Boleyn. And that's pretty much, how it's taught and how it's seen and how it's depicted. You never see Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon married, happy, and in love.
And I think one more question I have before I ask you my favorite question I have for you is there a historical figure that's linked to Henry VIII that you haven't seen a lot of historical reenactment of that you would love to see more of?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd like to see a little bit more of Thomas More. So I know people do Wolsey. I know someone that does Wolsey, so I've seen Wolsey reenacted a few times. I'd like to see more of Thomas More. That would be quite good, because especially if they're, which I'd imagine they would, someone that reenacts as Thomas More has that theological you can have that theological discussion with. That would be quite interesting. He was a very important part of Henry's reign, especially in the early part of Henry's reign. I mean, he eventually makes it to Lord Chancellor. I think it would be very interesting to see how Thomas More. I know one person that's portrayed Thomas More, and I did that with him a few years ago at Vallant's house in Dagenham, and he made a very good Thomas More. But I've only ever reenacted with the Thomas More once. But yeah, I think it would be very interesting to see how a reenactor brings, again, such a controversial figure in Tudor history. He's a religious fanatic, that he believes in the true faith. He doesn't like these heretical books that are coming. So he's torturing people, he's burning people, he's burning these books. He's famous for his book burning, apparently. And then on the other side, you've got this humanist, extraordinary theologian that connects with Henry on a completely different level to the rest of his courtiers, and he guides Henry in some ways, especially as a humanist and as a theologian. I mean, some people claim that he actually wrote the defense of the seven sacraments for Henry.
And I think my last question is, and I think you've probably got big plans for the future, is you spoke about how you love going to these events, you love going to schools, you love being able to show people online the things that you're doing. Is there any sort of dream goal that you have with your reenactment? I know some people probably want to see you in a movie or in a documentary, or perhaps maybe see you go to more events at these historic places. Is there anything that you would absolutely want as your, this is it moment? This is what I really wanted.
I've had my this is what I really wanted moment, and that was in June, and that was to reenact as Henry VIII at Hampton Court. And I got to do that in a very prestigious event. But there are other goals that are, would absolutely make my day, make my whole career worth it, even more so than it already is. And that is to be cast in some sort of series, maybe, or movie as Henry VIII, because I love acting. I love being Henry VIII, and I reckon I will do a fairly good portrayal in a movie. Give me a script and I'll certainly learn it. And maybe one day, when I get some time and patience, is actually write a book on young Henry VIII.
And I'm sure you will. And I just want to thank you so, so much, David, for joining me today. I know it's been a long time coming, and I'm sure a load of people who are going to be listening today are going to follow you and follow more of your journey, and perhaps get more interested in the historical reenactment. And they're also going to fall more in love with Henry VIII, with how much you're showing a different side to him, not just the mean and horrible fat side that we know him as.
Well, no, thank you for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure to speak to you and, to share what I absolutely love doing, and that is being Henry VIII.
We absolutely love your portrayal, and we know that you do such a good job. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. This is the ill-fated wives of Henry VIII signing off. Thank you and have a good day.